Hello everyone, welcome to the first session of Earthworks and Waterpower by Colin Drumm. The seminar investigates the history of state power in relation to the organization and financing of earthworks for irrigation and flood control. Since Wittfogel, earthworks, and the administration of hydraulic infrastructure have been listed to elaborate the Marxian category of Oriental Despotism, by means of which the supposed stagnation of non-Western state society could be explained. The seminar will begin by examining this literature before moving to the more contemporary scholarship on the deep history of hydraulic engineering and its relationship to money, the state, and the social processes of risk management. Water is both a necessary condition for life and a powerful and unpredictable threat. How have different societies responded to the need to manage the exposure to water, and what constraints have this need posed for the organizations, governance structures, and built environments? Colin is a PhD candidate in the history of consciousness at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He's currently writing a dissertation on the topic of monetary history and political philosophy, with a focus on Mediterranean antiquity and early modern England. So, Colin, you can go.
Thanks. My bio is a little out of date there. I finished my PhD in 2021. And these days I am organizing the member school, which is also a similar program to the New Center. I'm going to talk a little bit about some stuff we've been doing there as part of my opening remarks. Couple of housekeeping notes before we jump into it. If you're here, I would really appreciate it if you would participate with your camera on, as that makes it feel less. It's very alienating to speak to a bunch of black boxes on Zoom if you've ever had that experience. And then also on the readings. So there's a decent amount of reading on page count. I know probably not everybody is working in English as their first language. If you can't make it through all of the readings, that is okay. You don't need to despair or feel inadequate. I would like to encourage you to push yourself to read more than you think you can. And also I want to say that the readings that we're reading for this class are not dense philosophical readings, right? So while the page count is fairly high, I expect you should try to go faster rather than to absorb every single fact in detail, right? So the way that I would like you to approach these readings is that in class, we're going to be exploring a certain set of problems, right? And in my opening lecture today, I'm going to try to give you at least intellectual history according to Colin Drumm, which is different than intellectual history according to some others, about some of the problems that we're interested in here. And what I just encourage you to do when you're doing the readings is keep an eye out for stuff that pings those problems, right? So the purpose is not to learn every fact that's in the readings. The purpose is to go through, absorb as much material as you can, and keep an eye out for stuff that is relevant to the problems that we've been talking about, right? So I'm not going to quiz you on it. If you can't make it through it, it's okay. If you want more readings, then I can certainly give you more readings. So today we're so in today is a little different than the rest of the class because we're really setting the stage for what we're going to be doing. And we've started with Karl Wittfogel, Oriental Despotism, which we're reading not because it's a good book. It is in fact quite a bad book. I hope that you noticed. But we're reading it because it's there, and you will see this name cited in nearly every discussion of the topic that we're exploring today, which is the history of earthworks, right? Water management. What's its relation to power and the state? And if you look into that literature, you will see Wittfogel cited almost always. Now, he's usually going to be cited in a negative sense, right? Most scholars working in this field today feel haunted by Wittfogel, right? He's this guy where they'll be like, do I really have to address Wittfogel? Hasn't he been debunked already, right? This is sort of this feeling about him in the field. But he remains there, right? In a way that he's always sort of lurking in the background of the discussion. And so our purpose in this session is to try to get an idea of why that is, right? And to understand how Wittfogel ended up in the place that he does in this book. And so what I'm going to try to make the case for you now is that what's bad about this book is not randomly bad. Okay, it's not just randomly bad, it's specifically bad. And it's specifically bad because Wittfogel is really trying to deal he is a disappointed Marxist. We'll get into some of the facts about his personal biography, which are relevant. But what I'm going to try to suggest to you today is that he's really led to the position that he ends up in by certain problems in Marx and in the way that Marx thinks about history, power, nature, and the state, all these kinds of things. And so I want to. I'm going to try to make the case for the fact that Wittfogel is in some ways actually a sincere Marxist, even in his disappointment, in that where he ends up, which is as an anti-Marxist, a darling of the right in his later career, right? But he got there because he was actually mad and frustrated about certain problems within the Marxist conception of history, really. Right, that can't really be resolved, in my opinion. That are serious problems for the theory that might lead us to want to dispense with the theory altogether and to think about things a little differently. Okay, so and these are problems that are still active, that are live today, right? And I will speak a little bit probably about there's recent work by Kohei Saito that probably some of you are familiar with, Marx and the Anthropocene. There's really the question of how does Marxism think about nature? What is the Marxist theory of nature and the relation of humans to nature is a serious problem. There's been this attempt to rediscover Marx as an ecological thinker. I find that book to be quite unpersuasive. And so part of the reason that we're reading Wittfogel is that he's really, in some ways, the opening salvo, right, of this line of thought. In that he's one of the first writers who really tries to make an ecological Marxism, and that's where he ends up in the book that you read for today. Although it's no longer a Marxism, but what I'm going to try to suggest to you at least, right, that there's a certain fidelity to Marx that remains in this book, despite his, by this point, thoroughgoing anti-communism, right? And what I find kind of valuable about this, illustrative, right, is that sort of in my view, there's a dominant strand of reading Marx in academia, mostly today, that is really fundamentally apologetic, in the sense that it's mainly concerned with trying to save Marx from various accusations that might be made against him. And a lot of this ends up trying to get rid of a lot of things that Marx actually thought that we now find inconvenient, right? So in a way, the main mode of scholarship on Marx today is Marx didn't really think that, right? Marx didn't really think what you think he thought. In fact, his real views, which we have to reconstruct through little bits of notes, right? None of Marx's real views are what he actually says in his major works. They're views that we get hints of in notebooks, unpublished notes, and so on. And so we're going to reread all of his major works in a way that saves them. I want to be upfront here that I have no desire to save Marx. I'm not going to be engaging in any apologetics. I am rather going to be holding Marx to things that he actually does think, things that I think are fairly fundamental elements of his worldview, and that he came to through a certain engagement with earlier German thinkers, in particular Hegel. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Hegel too, because he pops up here. And again, I'm not a Hegelian. I'm not apologizing for Hegel. I regard Hegel as something of an enemy. So be warned about that. Okay. So one text, we'll get here, is one text that is central in the problem space of Marx and nature is a couple of drafts of an unsent letter to Vera Zasulich. Some of you, are you familiar with these letters? If I say the letters to Vera Zasulich, do you know what I'm talking about? No. Okay, good. I don't want to explain things that you already know, but if you don't know, then I'm happy to explain. So Marx, these are letters that Saito hangs a lot of his case on. They're off in some ways, like if you go to a university and you talk about Marx, you will very quickly run into these letters, because they are seen as solving certain problems for Marxists, to show, just to say, look, Marx was really thinking about these things that you would want to claim that he's not thinking about. And the essence of these letters is that Vera Zasulich, who is a Russian Marxist, although not of the party that Marx was supporting. So there were a couple of different Marxist parties in Russia, one of which Marx was kind of supporting, and Zasulich is from a different one. But she writes to Marx and says, hey, Marx, like, we need you to clarify like something that's been bothering us, because in Capital you write that well, you essentially suggest that when Russia, for example, looks to Western Europe, which has already undergone the process of industrialization, you, Russians, are looking at an image of your own future, right? So he sort of suggests that there is a process of industrialization, modernization, the development of capitalism, what have you, that is a model trajectory through which other societies can be expected to travel. Okay, a stage theory of history. He does in fact have a stage theory of history. This is a problem for the Russian communists, right? Because they're saying, well, so what does that mean? Does that mean that we, who are, well, we have a society that is characterized by an Asiatic despotism, perhaps, right? What does that mean exactly? Well, we're going to be talking about that for the rest of today, right? But we have an agrarian society. We have a society that has not fully industrialized. It has not undergone, for example, the enclosures of the commons, right, in England. We haven't kicked all the peasants off the land, sent them into the cities. We haven't in particular, right? We haven't developed large-scale plantation agriculture, right? We haven't developed modern rational agriculture, all of these sorts of processes. And in much of his writings, right? So here in what I say on the history of Marxist thought, I'm in some ways drawing on a series of classes taught by Jared Baxter at the Member School on the early Marx and Marx's writing around 1848. If anybody in this class is interested in looking at some of those videos, I'd be happy to pass them along to you. But Marx around 1848, just send me an email, Colin Drumm at Gmail, you can, or in Discord or whatever. So around 1848, right, which is kind of the middle period of Marx, Marx is reflecting on these ongoing revolutions, failed revolutions, right, and reflecting on them using the model of the French Revolution, which of course happened 50 years before, a couple of generations before. And Marx very much has the idea, right, that what some might call the bourgeois revolutions, right, are necessary. They are necessary steps in the development of history that are going to lead the way to a future society, right, but which are not themselves yet that future society. And his model for this, okay, comes from the French Revolution, and essentially it's 1789 and 1794 is it, I think. So we have, first of all, the storming of the Bastille. This is the general revolution, and then the Terror, which is the Jacobin Revolution, right? So the Jacobins radicalize the previous revolution, which was more broad-based in coalition, which included capitalists, right? Bourgeois. So Marx really thought about things in this way, right? There's the first revolution, which is the bourgeois revolution. What is its purpose? What is its historical mission? Well, its historical mission is to complete the centralization of the modern state, right? It's to rationalize the state, to call to create the kind of state that Hegel talks about. And we'll get to that in a second, okay? But this was not enough, thinks Marx. Why? Well, because, you know, there's still the exploitation of the working class by the capitalists. But what this first revolution is going to do is going to set the conditions of possibility for developing the productive forces, right? I mean, it's the victory of the industrialists that allows them to invest in industrialization that will develop the productive forces, all of which will eventually be seized by the proletariat in the second revolution during the terror. Okay, this is kind of his model. And so the question for the Russian communists is, well, if we haven't had the first revolution, how can we have the second one? Can we just jump straight ahead to communism? Or do we have to first fully develop a liberal bourgeois industrial society? Right? This was their problem. And so Zasulich writes to Marx and and says, quotes this section from Capital in which Marx seems to suggest that all other countries are going to have to pass through the same stages that France and then Germany passed through in order to get to communism. This has a concrete consequence for Russian politics, which is whether the existing peasant communes need to be dissolved or whether they should be protected, right? Should Marxists, support the dissolution of the Mir, the peasant commune, in favor of the rationalization of agriculture, the introduction of industrial agriculture, which of course is sort of what the Soviets actually did, right? When they collectivized agriculture. They were kind of following this model. Marx, in his letter, he doesn't really want to say that. It seems that he feels a little bad about saying, yes, all of this stuff that I've been describing as historical violence that makes capitalism possible, right? All of in the primitive accumulation chapters in Capital, all of this terrible things that happened to the peasants. But he feels sort of bad about saying, yeah, you've got to do that now, right? In order to reach the end goal. So this is a problem for him because I want to kind of suggest it's really the way we should understand Marxist theory of history is as a kind of theodicy. Now, what is theodicy? Theodicy is a story that justifies the existence of evil, okay, given the postulation of a all-knowing, all-powerful, and benevolent God. Okay, so theodicy is a classic problem in religious thought. I'm sure you've thought of this before, right? If God is so great and so powerful, why does he allow bad things to happen? Even worse, why does he make bad things happen, et cetera, and so forth, right? So theodicy stories are often a central part of historical myth making. And what Marx is really doing is creating a theodicy for modernity. Now, it's not that he's happy, right, that modernity happened, although Marx, especially in 1848 writings and a number of other places, really hates peasants. This is something that should be understood about Marx. Hates peasants, hates rural life, thinks essentially that a rural life is not truly human or worth living. Right? These are things that he kind of suggests in various places. And so, while, yeah, it's bad, it's violent. I'm not advocating or in favor or excited about the violence itself. It's violence that is ultimately worth it, right? In that the world that will emerge from all of this violence is going to be better than the world that existed before it. Okay, this is central. If you don't think this, you aren't really a Marxist, right? If you think that it would have been better for capitalism never to have been developed, for fossil fuels to have never been exploited, for Europeans to have never colonized the planet and brought with them market capitalism and industrial production and all of those things. If you think it really would have been better if none of that had happened, you're not really a Marxist, right? So while there may have been a primitive communism, right, and Marx does talk about primitive communism, it is nonetheless primitive. And wouldn't you rather have a communism that wasn't primitive? And in what sense isn't it primitive? Well, in the sense that you humans now have a different relation to nature. Okay. So yeah, in primitive communism, sure, maybe we all live communally and we share everything, and everything is from each according to his ability and to each according to his needs, and so on and so forth. I mean, even if we postulate that really is how so-called primitive societies are, which I think we should be skeptical of, but that's another class. Even if we postulate that, it remains the case that you are dominated by nature, that you have to work in order to eat, that you don't have all of these modern conveniences that we're all that save us from the necessity of of earning our bread by the sweat of our brow. Okay. So all of this means that ultimately, despite how violent the history of modernity and capitalism is, okay, the world that will emerge from it is better than the world that was destroyed by it. This is a fundamental part of the Marxist worldview. If you don't think that, you're not a Marxist. Okay. Okay. So Marx, in these drafts of these letters, which he ends up sending like a very short thing in which he, kind of punts on it really. He really tries to come up with an explanation for why his theory doesn't really say that, right? Why his theory doesn't really say, yes, you're gonna have to destroy the peasant communes in order to modernize agriculture so you can set the stage of history for the progress of et cetera and so forth, right? He doesn't really want to say that. But he doesn't really, in my view, come up with a very a convincing answer, and I don't think he was convinced by it either, which is why he doesn't send the letters. I mean, you can go look at the letters. I recommend it. I can find them and put them up there in volume 24 of the Mega. The he kind of repeats himself a lot in those letters. You can sense that he's kind of bugged by it. He doesn't really know what to say, and he's kind of but one of the things that he does suggest, right, that Wittfogel picks up on, right, is that there's some kind of relationship between dispersed villages, right? Those of you who are familiar with the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, right? There's a famous line about how the peasants are a class like a sack of potatoes is a collection of potatoes or something like this. His point is that the peasants are just so distributed that they're just members of a group without having any kind of class consciousness, right? They aren't peasants together. They're just peasants singly and individually dispersed everywhere, right? And this is a problem for them. Marx suggests that there's some kind of relationship between the scattered peasant communes and a despotic state, right? That the threat to the communes is a state, and a powerful state, and that the geographical distribution of these villages is in some way what enables the state. And he connects this historically to the domination of the Mongols over Russia, okay? The Khanate of the Golden Horde, which, by the way, if you saw recently, I would encourage, it's amusing, Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin that came out recently. I assume people have seen this, in which Putin offers Carlson a history lesson. Now, if you pay attention to what Putin is saying, there is an entire period of Russian history which he does not mention, and it's the period of the Golden Horde. Okay, he does not want to talk about the period of Mongol hegemony over what is now Russia. So there's a certain kind of problem here that remains. Okay, so Wittfogel picks up on this. Okay, so I'm gonna put a semicolon in that. I'm gonna start a new topic for a moment, and then we'll try to tie them together in a moment. So I want to talk about how Marx gets to his critique of political economy in the first place. Why does Marx start reading Smith, Ricardo, developing a theory of capital? What's the intellectual trajectory that leads him there? In what I'm about to say about Marx's own personal intellectual history, I'm dissenting somewhat from what is probably the most common reading that you'll hear today, which is in some way Althusserian or related. And what this means is that they posit that there's some kind of fundamental break between the early Marx and the mature Marx. Okay. Why did they do this? Well, when Marx's early writings were rediscovered, essentially in sometime during the Soviet period, they were a bit of a scandal for the Soviets because they are all kind of like there's these humanistic writings. He talks about democracy a lot. He talks about freedom a lot. One of Marx's main concerns in this period is the freedom of the press. In fact, that's where he starts off, essentially. Marx essentially starts off his career as an advocate for freedom of the press and tax avoidance. He's an anti-tax activist, and he wants there to be free press. Those are some of his earliest writings, and these are kind of inconvenient for like the Stalinists, right? Because he doesn't seem to be describing the Soviet state, and so as part of this, right, there's this idea of a break or whatever, right? That, oh no, these writings are fundamentally different from the mature Marx. But what I'm going to suggest here is an account of Marx's intellectual trajectory that has more continuity in it. I don't think he really breaks. I think he's fairly consistent, in fact, over his career, over his interests and his problem space. So where does his problem space begin? Like I say, he begins by criticizing the Prussian state as essentially being hypocritical, right? And, so he says, you, the state, are supposed to be, well, what? You're supposed to be kind of this neutral arbitrator over and above society, through which all the various private interests of society are reconciled. Okay, this is the Hegelian theory of the state, that in civil society, you've got all these various private interests. I mean, you've got the linen manufacturers, right? You've got the shepherds or whatever, right? So you've got all these people, and they have their own private interests. And if there weren't a state, then they would just be in conflict with one another over their differing private interests. But the state exists in order to harmonize these interests, right? To reconcile them and to produce. It's only through the state, says Hegel, right, that society can be produced as an ethical totality. Right? And that's the purpose of the state. Now, what makes this possible according to Hegel? Well, what makes this possible according to Hegel is that in addition to all of the classes of people in civil society, there is a universal class, right? Hegel is the one who kind of originally posits this idea of a universal class, right? In other words, a class that has no interest in particular, that doesn't have its own particular interest, but merely has the interests of society as a whole. Who are these people for Hegel? It's the bureaucracy. Okay. So in Hegel, we have the idea that there is a state bureaucracy that can mediate and harmonize all the competing interests of civil society. And they're able to do this. Why? Well, because they're paid a salary by the state. And because the bureaucracy is paid a salary by the state, they have no interests other than the stability of the state, right? What's the idea here? Well, if you didn't pay the bureaucracy, how would they have to get their money? By taking bribes, right? So if they didn't get paid, there would be corruption. So the fact that you have a professional bureaucracy paid a salary means for Hegel, they don't need to take any bribes. And their interest is just in the stability of the state itself, because that's what pays their salary. And so they're able to be a universal class that rises above the conflicts of civil society and harmonizes and reconciles them. Okay, that's Hegel. Now, Marx begins his career by complaining that the state is not really living up to its concept. Okay, that the state claims to be this thing that Hegel says that it is, but in fact, it's not really doing that. And in particular, it's not doing that because they seize Marx's printing press and kick him out. Right? They shut down his newspaper and other sorts of things. There's a very interesting text if you're interested in the early Marx the piece on thefts of wood. Marx has a very interesting piece. It's probably one of my favorite pieces by Marx about punishments for people taking wood from privately owned forests and things like this. And this is where he sort of begins to develop this Marxist critique that says, well, even if the state pretends to sort of treat everyone equally, because there are real differences, right? There are real class differences. That's not formal equality is not the same thing as substantive equality. Okay, that's at the core of the Marxist view, is that you can have formal equality without substantive equality. Once this is not a quote by Marx, but somebody else. But the rich and the poor are equally forbidden from sleeping under the bridge. Right. Okay. Well, outlawing sleeping under the bridge affects one kind of person and not another kind of person, and the formal equality seems like a smokescreen over substantive inequality. Okay. Now, okay, so Marx develops this whole sort of criticism of Hegel, and where does this lead him? Okay. Now, where it leads him is to say that the state claims to be universal, but really it serves the interests of property. Okay. The state's claimed universality is really just the interests of property. And even if the state doesn't favor the interests of one kind of property over another, right? Particular sectors, industries, or whatever, it still favors property in general or as such. Okay. Now, what Marx then wants to try to show, and this, I think, is his motivating problem for the rest of his career, is to show how there's a contradiction within the concept of property itself that must eventually destabilize the state, right? That the state cannot really serve the interests of property in general. Why? Well, because of the whole theory of capital, which we won't go into, but more or less, right? That you can never pay the workers enough to buy the stuff that you produce. There's always more stuff than you can actually sell and make a profit. And so this is going to produce instability in the system, right? So that's the purpose of Marxist theory, is to show that even if, okay, so this is key, and this is what's going to bring us to Wittfogel. Okay, even if the state really is dominated by private interests, okay, by the private interests of property in general, such that the state is nothing other than the managing committee of the bourgeoisie. Okay, the state has no interests other of its own. It simply carries out the interests of those who own property. Okay, even if that's the case, says Marx, there's still a problem here. There's a contradiction that must produce an instability that will have to give rise to a new historical form. Okay, and of course a new instability. So what was the first instability is what's called the master-slave dialectic. Are people kind of familiar with that whole myth, or should I rehearse this? Okay, let me go ahead and rehearse it. Okay, this is in Hegel. It's the Lord and Bondsman chapter. In certain readings of Hegel, particularly that of Kojève, which is very influential on 20th century French thought, the Hegelians will say it's not really Hegel. They have a couple of complaints, one of which is that Kojève elevates the master-slave dialectic as the key to all of Hegel's philosophy. Regardless of that, this story of the master-slave dialectic that Hegel lays out in Lord and Bondsman chapter is, I think it's important to understand, the central myth that European modernity has about itself, right? If who do modern Europeans, and I don't just mean Europeans, but those who are ideologically invested in a European order, a European conception of things, which can include lots of people who aren't ethnically European. Okay, what's the myth? The myth is that in the past, we had a society characterized by domination, okay, by unequal exchange. You have masters and slaves, lords and bondsmen, right? There's, another thing people like to argue about is how to translate the word knecht, which can mean slave or it can mean serf, kind of, or servant or whatever. But it doesn't really matter. The point is that there's the idea that in the past, in medieval Europe, in feudal Europe, you had a society in which power relations are simply inscribed on the surface, right? I am the lord, you are the serf, we are unequal. So we don't have the idea that people are equal. We have the idea that people are unequal, and one dominates the other, and that's just how things are. Now, the myth says that this situation is unstable. There's a couple of different readings of why you might think it's unstable. The kind of first level reading is that the master needs recognition. Okay, that the master, he needs to be recognized as the master, right? He needs that from other people, right? I mean, so there's a way in which if I can't just be the master if nobody recognizes me as that, right? So my mastery is dependent upon the recognition of other people. But that puts me, the master, in a bind, because then I have to recognize other people as having the recognition that I want, right? Which means that I'm now in their power instead of them being dominated by me, right? So needing to be recognized by others as being the master puts me in their power. Okay, that's one kind of reading of it. Another kind of reading of it, which I think is maybe more concrete and sensible, is just that, the master doesn't do anything. The master just consumes stuff. Okay, so the master enjoys without working, while the slave works without enjoying. Now, that might seem like the master's in the driver's seat, right? I mean, if I have a servant and I say, bring me my coffee, and I just stand here and my servant comes and brings me the coffee, I enjoy the coffee. I didn't have to work for it. My servant had to make the coffee and doesn't get to drink any, and it seems like I'm in charge, right? Well, okay. But suppose something happens and my servant gets run over by a bus. I don't even know how to make my coffee, right? I'm helpless, right? So by being the master, what have I given up? Well, I've given up the necessity of laboring on nature to negate it and make it into something other than it is. Okay. So the slave, precisely through obeying the commands of the master to deliver to him his desires, learns something important. And what he learns is how to be free. Okay. What does it mean to be free? It means to negate necessity and enter the realm of freedom. What's necessity? Nature. Okay. Nature is what says if you don't eat, you're going to starve. You have to work for your food. All other sorts of things like this. Okay. Yeah, but through working, right? Through my delayed gratification, I work while projecting what I'm working for further and further into the future. I learned something incredibly important, which is that I can negate nature and remake it in my own image such that it serves my wants, right? Okay, and I learned to be free. And the myth is that, right, Europeans, through the experience of slavery, by which they mean feudalism, okay? They don't mean chattel slavery. When modern Europeans are always talking about slavery, and they're never talking about the Atlantic slave trade. They're always talking about themselves and their own medieval past, right? When we were slaves, i.e. serfs or whatever, peasants, okay? We learned how to be free, right? We learned something from the experience of slavery, and that was how to negate nature as a necessity that dominates us and to develop our productive powers and enter the realm of freedom. Okay, so this is the Hegel myth, and in Hegel's conception of this, right, what happens after we overcome mastery, which happens during the French Revolution. Okay. So during the French Revolution, those who were slaves realize that they're the ones with the power. They're the ones who know how to do everything. Marie Antoinette doesn't even know how to make cake. Okay. We're the ones who know how to make cake. So why do we need her? And get rid of her. Okay, great. Now we're free. Okay. And now we've entered into a kind of society that is fundamentally different from a society characterized by inequality and the domination of masters over slaves. We now live in a society in which everybody does what they do, right? Because they signed up for it. We live in a society of the contract in which all of our relations are those we signed up for. You know, I mean, I signed up to teach this class at the New Center. You know, they said, Colin, do this for us and we'll give you this amount of money. And I said, okay, right? I mean, so everything's like that, right? Isn't it? Right? So, and because everything that we have to do and everything that we get is what we signed up for with full knowledge of what we are signing up for, we're free, right? There's no more domination, right? I mean, that's Hegel and that's Milton Friedman, right? Milton Friedman is a Hegelian in this sense, that in the sense of positing that the market society is already the absolute society. Absolute in the sense that subjects and objects are fully transparent to one another, right? That and that my relations to others don't depend upon a misrecognition of what kind of relation they are. Okay, this was the problem with the pre-revolutionary society, was that in order for Marie Antoinette to eat the cake and all of us make the cake, we have to misrecognize the situation that we're in, right? If we actually understand the situation that we're in, the situation has to cease to exist, right? If we actually understand that we make the cake, she eats the cake, she doesn't know how to eat the cake, I mean, she didn't know how to make a cake, and we're the ones with all the power. I mean, as soon as we realize that, the situation ends. I mean, now we're no longer making cakes for Marie Antoinette. So this is a kind of society that depends on its continued existence on a misrecognition, a misunderstanding by the parties in that situation, what kind of a situation it is. And says Hegel, says Milton Friedman, the market society is no longer like this because it doesn't require any misrecognition, because everything about everything is in the contracts, and you read the contract and you signed up for it. Okay. So the purpose of Marxist critique, and again, this is not a class on capital, right? But is to try to show how even this society still involves misrecognition of some kind, right? That even though it seems like we live in this society in which everything's based on free contracts and all of this stuff, there's still some kind of misrecognition happening. And this is the whole theory of exploitation, the theory of the crisis tendencies of capitalism. So one way to understand Marx's claim in this language of recognition, okay, is that capitalism cannot recognize all of the value it creates. Capitalism creates value that it cannot itself recognize, and that it therefore has to destroy and waste. But that if we took collective ownership of the means of production, then we could recognize all of the value that capitalism creates but does not itself recognize. Okay? I hope you follow what I'm saying. It's not really our main topic, but it is relevant to what we're about to say. Okay. So now, what this class is really about. Yes, please.
Could you repeat your last sentence?
I think I said that.
So capitalism cannot recognize the value it produces, yes? And it has to waste. So, and after that you said, but another kind of society could do that, huh?
Yes. So
did I get that right? Okay.
Yes. So Marx's diagnosis of a crisis of capitalism, right? What he wants to explain is a situation in which capitalists have produced a lot of stuff that they can't sell, and workers are unemployed. Now, and because they're unemployed, they can't buy stuff, right? And now, so and then what happens? Well, if you're a capitalist and you've produced a bunch of stuff you can't sell, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to close your factory and lay off your workers. What does that do? Well, now there's even fewer workers to buy your stuff, and so now you've got even more stuff you can't sell, and you have a deflationary spiral, right? That's what Marx is.
So according to Marx, is this like a logical contradiction in the concept of labor, or is it something
in the concept of property? In the concept of property. Yes. According to Marx,
maybe this goes back to like your potentia, huh? Your potential for work is not a substantial entity like an ontic thing, but property is. So maybe all this goes back to this. Can we say that?
I'm not sure I follow your formulation exactly.
Like, for example, I have this potential for work, but this is not like a concrete something. Okay, it could change. It could do many different things, but then capitalism only wants to reduce it to something repetitive so that it can take out, extract surplus value.
Okay.
So there is a contradiction, huh?
Yes, well, Marx thinks that capitalism, yeah, he does think that, right? That there's something good about the human capacity to labor. And what's good about it? It negates nature. Okay? Negating nature is good because now we're not oppressed by it anymore, right? I mean, we don't have to go hungry, so that's good. But
Yes.
the system of capitalism, yeah, well, he has stuff about what we would now call de-skilling and what he calls alienation and all this other kind of stuff. But the contradiction that I'm talking about is really not in labor but in property, right? The contradiction is in property. And the contradiction is that, right? In order to make profits from having these machines that help you make stuff, you got to sell it to somebody. But the more you develop the machines that replace labor, right, the fewer people there are to sell stuff to. I mean, that's the contradiction, right?
It's kind of like a universe in which, if we take it to the absolute ridiculous extreme, everything turns into actually property. Everything turns into substances without the ability to be human, to be interacting and actually developing these stuff. Huh?
Yeah.
Maybe.
So what you're kind of talking about is more the concern of the early Marx, and this is why Althusser wanted to make a difference, right? Now, we can talk about this. We can talk about all of this stuff off class because it gets us into Marx, and I'm trying to get us out of Marx. But I'm happy to talk about it elsewhere. It's not about what I'm talking about here, at least, is not about the alienation of humanity's creative potential and all that kind of stuff. Marx does think that, right? But what I'm want to emphasize here is the contradiction that he diagnoses in the form of property itself. And ultimately, this contradiction leads, Marx thinks, right, to a situation in which we have a society that's produced all these amazing machines. I mean, you push a button and food comes out, right? I mean, you push a button and shoes come out. Look at all these shoes we have. We could all have 100 pairs of shoes. And you have a situation in which you developed all of these amazing productive potentials, and that creates a problem because now there's too many shoes and you can't sell any of them, which means that the shoe factory is going to shut down and fire its workers, and now those workers can't buy any shoes, right? I mean, so Marx thinks that the development of the productive forces in the aftermath of the modern revolution, right, leads to a situation in which capitalism cannot recognize all the value it creates. But communism could. I mean, that's the idea, right? That's what communism means. Communism is a society that is actually capable of recognizing all the value it creates. And why is it capable of that? Because it no longer has private property. Okay. Yes, Ananya.
So then is capitalism a necessary first stage to create surplus for communism?
Yes, that's the issue. So that's what I began by speaking about, right? So I hope you see all of this that I've been trying to explain. I'm going through this at light speed, okay? But that's the problem that the Russian communists write Marx about. They say, "Hey man, we're big fans of your book, but like we have a question, you know? I mean, do we have to do this? I mean, do we have to do all of the stuff that you've been writing about how evil it is? Because this is an evil that's necessary in order to achieve freedom historically, because that is what Marx says. But he says it because he's trying to tell a story about the evil that's already happened and how that evil is going to be redeemed historically and made worth something, right? He wasn't advocating the violence in the first place, but now he's being asked to say whether he's advocates doing the violence in the first place, right? Which puts him in a tricky spot. He doesn't want to do that, right? I mean, Marx is a figure for whom I have less and less sympathy the more I read about him. I really don't like the guy these days much anymore, although I was very much a Marxist in my 20s. But I mean, he's not like a bad guy, I mean, really. I mean, he doesn't want to just say, yeah, you've got to go murder some peasants and steal all their land. I mean, he's a little leery of allowing himself to be committed to what seems to be a consequence of everything else that he's saying. And that's how I would read these letters to Vera Zasulich, which I'll post someplace. Okay. Okay, so Wittfogel. So now on to Wittfogel. All of this left Marxists with a problem. It's a little bit embarrassing for them that they didn't have the revolution in France and Germany. Okay, in 1848, these are the writings that Marx and Engels produced around the revolutions of 1848 are very unfortunate. They say a lot of essentially racist things about Slavs, right? They really don't like Slavs. They describe Slavs as unhistorical peoples. Okay, so they have Hegel has a schema of like basically all of history is like there's 4 historical peoples, of which the Germans are the last. We're completing world history, etc., and so forth. Marx and Engels in this period sort of saw the Slavs as just obstacles in the way of the completion of history by the Germans. They also desired and anticipated a general German war against the Slavs that would serve the purpose of uniting the German state. So they kind of wanted Germany to unite and perpetrate a war against the Slavs in order to unify the German state in the same way that Napoleon unified the French state by conducting his wars. Okay, so they have kind of this idea that we need a good war in order to really complete the process of modernization, and these Slavs, I mean, they say things like, look at them, they even speak German, so what right do they have to really be an independent people, and all of this kind of stuff, right? These are very unfortunate writings. So they don't like Slavs very much. They see them as unhistorical peoples. And again, I mean, they also have this idea. So another of Marx's obsessions in this period is that he's really mad at the German bourgeoisie for being cowards. He's like, these guys are cowards. And why are they cowards? Because they are failing to achieve their historical mission, right? They're not doing what they're supposed to do because they're cowards, and he's sort of trying to exhort them, right, to do what they're supposed to do, to carry out the mission of creating the bourgeois state, because he thinks that's the necessary precondition for going on to the next stage. Okay, so this is all kind of embarrassing for them, for Marxists in the 20th century, that the Marxist revolutions happened in agrarian backwaters, right? The periphery of the European world system. I mean, Russia was a major grain exporter to. That's a big part of the Russian economy. That's how all of these. I mean, you read Tolstoy and stuff. That's how all these Tolstoy's guys make their fortunes and things. They're exporting grain to the industrial center in Europe, and they're the periphery. So why is it, right? How could it be that it's like, these backwards countries that actually experience revolutions, and the revolutions don't happen where Marx predicted they would happen in France and Germany? But I should say part of the answer that Marx gives to Vera Zasulich, which again, you read Saito or some other people who will emphasize that these are writings in which Marx gives Russians historical agency. He's not as bad as you would think from reading his other writings. Well, part of Marx's answer is essentially, well, we Germans already invented all of this machines and stuff, so y'all can just kind of import it and skip that step, right? So part of his answer is, you don't have to do history because we already did it, and you can just import our conclusions, right? That's part of his answer to the Russians, which is not. I mean, maybe it's a good answer, right? Yeah, yeah. You don't have to do this because we already have the machines. We can just sit. All you got to do is steal the blueprints and make them, and there you go. And you don't have to do all of this enclosures and everything. That's part of the answer that he tries to give. But anyway, there's a couple of embarrassments for Marxists in the 20th century, one of which is, why are the successful revolutions not in the place where Marxist theory says they should be, instead they're in this other place? And then the second problem, of course, is Stalinism. Okay. We had these Marxist revolutions, and it turns out that the state didn't wither away. Okay. So Marx's concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, this is probably something you've heard of, right? It's important to understand. There's a reason that Marx calls it the dictatorship of the proletariat and not the tyranny of the proletariat. Right? He doesn't talk about the tyranny of the proletariat. He talks about the dictatorship of the proletariat. What's the purpose of the dictatorship concept? Well, dictatorship now in sort of our people use dictator and tyrant in sort of interchangeable ways, as though these are the same kind of figure. It's bad. It's authoritarian. Dictatorship, at least in traditional Roman historiography, is a constitutional office. Okay, the dictatorship is not an unconstitutional ruler. He's a constitutional ruler who is summoned to be a dictator during a time of emergency. And what makes the dictatorship constitutional is that it's a time-limited office. Okay, the dictatorship is a dictator for the period of the emergency, and once the emergency is over, he's no longer the dictator, right? The dictatorship ends. So a perpetual dictatorship is a contradiction in terms. It's an oxymoron. No such thing, right? It's not a dictatorship in the strict sense. So when Marx talks about the dictatorship of the proletariat, he has this idea that it's a fundamentally temporary and time-limited regime, right? It's about securing the revolution. This is the terror, right? But even people who are in favor of the terror don't think the terror is going to go on forever. I mean, maybe some of them do, but then you would be really, I think, a fascist and not a leftist at all. Okay, they don't think it's permanent. It's necessary while we're securing the regime. And once the revolutionary regime is secure, then Marx really thought that the state would wither away. The state would no longer be necessary. Why? Well, because for Marx, the purpose of the state is to reconcile the various contradictory interests of different kinds of private property. And once we've accomplished revolution, there won't be any property anymore. So there won't be any need for a state. Okay. So again, there are certain, you may run into out there in the wild, something called a Republican reading of Marx, which attempts to sort of paint Marx as a political thinker. Marx is really an anti-political thinker. He thought that to the extent that there's any such thing as politics at all, it's because that there's still private property, and once we get rid of private property, there won't be any politics. Politics will have ended. This is really his idea. This comes out in certain texts where he's commenting on Bakunin. So Bakunin, the Russian anarchists, are some of the first people who make this criticism, where they say, you Marxists, you failed to consider, right, the fact that when you set up this revolutionary state, it's going to have its own momentum, right, its own reason for existence. and you know, the party will care about the party and perpetuating the party. And if the goal of the party is to abolish the need to have the party, then the party's not going to do that, right? Why would the party want to abolish its own reason for existence, right? So the Bakunin and the Russian anarchists are some of the first people who raised this criticism, which really bothered Marx and Engels. I mean, they spent a lot of their later career fighting with these guys, right, to explain why this wouldn't be the case. Anyway, but Marx in some texts where he comments on Bakunin really makes it clear that he thinks this is ridiculous. That yes, the purpose is to end politics, not to have if you have politics that goes on forever, again, not a Marxist or something else. Okay, so of course it's scandalous that there's Stalin comes to power and purges all the old Bolsheviks, right? So Stalin purges all the guys who are part of the original revolutionary movement, replaces them with his own people, and so on and so forth, and we get totalitarianism or whatever, and of course the Marxists are concerned about this. I mean, this is why we have what's called Western Marxism. What's Western Marxism? Well, it's Marxism, but we're against Stalin, right? We're Marxists, yeah, but we're like pro freedom, as opposed to being pro Stalin. Okay, that's Western Marxism. Okay, so Wittfogel is responding to this whole problem space, and so what I think we can get out of him, despite the fact, and I hope you notice there's almost nothing about waterworks in this entire book. Right, I have a read on why that's the case, right? What we're going to read for the next 3 sessions of this class, we're going to actually learn about dams and irrigation and all this kind of stuff, right? We're going to learn about these things. Wittfogel is almost totally uninterested in those things. He just gestures at them vaguely, right? That's a symptom. That's important. This is a very incurious book. It's a book by a guy who has a general concept that explains everything, and the purpose is just to sort of list examples of how everything accords to the general concept. There's no curiosity of looking into the world and being willing to be surprised by what you find, and then allowing what you find to try to challenge concepts that you already have. So that's the way that I would like you all to approach the reading for the rest of this class. Be willing to be surprised by what you find, right? Look for surprises. Don't try to collect examples of how your concepts that you already have apply to everything, which is all that Wittfogel is doing. Okay, and also we should note that Wittfogel, in a way, he's less interested in water than he is in the act of prostration. I don't know if people notice this, right? Wittfogel is real, and eunuchs. He's worried about eunuchs, and he's worried about prostration. Okay, I mean, there's much more about that than there is about water in this book. And so yeah, I mean, okay, so well, I'll try to explain why I think that's happening in a second. So Wittfogel, in his earlier years, he has a essay that I didn't assign, an earlier piece during when he's still a Marxist, called Geopolitics, Geographical Materialism, and Marxism, in which he essentially is trying to get Stalin to think about ecology, right? So Wittfogel is the first ecological Marxist in his early years, where he said, hey, you Marxists, I mean, you got to think about more about nature. You got to think more about ecology. You need a theory of geography. You can't just imagine the world as this, blank slate for humans to impose their will upon, as just this thing that you're going to negate and remake in your own image, et cetera, and so forth. I mean, this is not going to work. You need to think more about nature. He gets rebuffed by Stalin. Stalin has no use for all of this, and seems to have took it rather personally. Right, so Wittfogel's anti-Marxist turn seems to have been motivated in part by personal disappointment about not having acquired the ear of Stalin about introducing ecology into the theory of official Marxism. okay, so where he then and then of course he becomes disillusioned with it. He becomes one of these, I mean, Western conservatives love it when there's former Marxists who turn against totalitarianism and all of this stuff. I mean, they eat that up, and so that was really his audience for his later work. What's he trying to argue? Well, he's trying to produce an explanation for why the Russian Revolution ended up how it did with Stalinism and totalitarianism and all of that. And his answer is really just a form of an older kind of racism, right? This is a racist book. His answer to solving this problem is because they're Oriental. But it retains a certain vestigial element of a materialist theory of nature. And basically his answer to this now is that, well, there's this thing called the Asiatic mode of production, which is something Marx does talk about. Okay. Marx takes up this concept from Hegel. So all of this stuff, Asiatic despotism, all this stuff is in Hegel. It's in the theories on the lectures on history. Hegel saw the East as a place where nothing happens, right? Where they, they have this motionless philosophy, right? Because they have no progress and all of that kind of stuff, and because they have no freedom, right? So for Hegel, for whom human history is the unfolding of the idea of freedom through time, right? Asia is kind of outside of this. In setting this up, Hegel is drawing on a trope that goes all the way back to classical Athens, and you can find in the classical Greek writers, according to which, in the East, by which they mean the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, everybody is a slave of the great king. Okay? So there is an idea going back to classical Greece, according to which the East, again, by which they mean Persia, is a world in which nobody has any freedom because everybody is a slave of the great king. Now, and actually, we're doing a reading group on Persia, and I was actually somewhat surprised to find out that the great king actually does refer to everybody as his slave. He actually calls everybody his slave. But this is probably more a matter of rhetoric than a matter of reality, right? I mean, so he says he'll write letters where he'll be like, I've sent my slave so and so to to bring you this thing or whatever. But it doesn't. Now, to what extent does calling somebody his slave? To what extent is that a kind of rhetorical thing? To what extent does it describe actual conditions of legal unfreedom, right? And it seems to be more of the first than the other. But the Greeks had this idea. They took this at face value or whatever, and they really thought, that in Persia everybody was a slave of the king, and that's why it's so important not to get conquered by Persia, because then we will lose our freedom. Anyway, Hegel takes that up, kind of extends it to everybody's not European, right? I mean, so another thing I hope you notice about this book: who's Oriental for Wittfogel? Everybody who's not European. I mean, Incas are Oriental. I mean, what does that mean? If at the point that you're calling the Inca Empire Asiatic, I mean, what are we even talking about here? So it's everybody who isn't European. So really, it's not that there is such a thing as the Asiatic mode of production. It's that there's a specific thing about Westerners, right? There's something specific about European geography that gives Europeans the capacity to be free. And it has something to do with water. This is a thesis that you'll find in Jared Diamond also, by the way. Jared Diamond says much the same thing. Okay, so what's the idea here? Well, the idea here is that, if you've got a mode of production that is based around doing a lot of like waterworks, you need to build big dams, you need to build irrigation canals. Wittfogel thinks, right, that you need a state in order to mobilize corvée labor, which means essentially drafted labor. The state just shows up and says, all right, you're working for us this month, go dig a ditch, right? So you need coerced unpaid labor, essentially, says Wittfogel, and you need the state to coordinate all this massive investment activity that's happening in order to manage water, right? And that's where Oriental despotism comes from, says Wittfogel. And I guess presumably he thinks that in Europe this doesn't happen. Although, of course, notice that Wittfogel in this book says almost nothing about the Netherlands, which is a massively hydraulically altered place. You know, I mean, the Dutch, who invented really a lot of like what we call modern capitalism, right? Really, you know, I mean, the Dutch sort of kind of conquered England in 1688, right? And they brought with them, in particular, certain financial technologies that became the basis of the Bank of England and all this other kind of stuff. And they were already having a textile revolution, and they had a whole empire and everything. I mean, you know, the Dutch who really sort of invented modern capitalism in a way, right? I mean, they had all these, like, you know, most of their land is below sea level. But for mysterious reasons that Wittfogel doesn't mention. I looked through, Marx mentions Holland at one point, and Wittfogel passes over this quickly without really commenting on it, right? It's not at all clear why Wittfogel's argument about everybody else doesn't apply to Holland, for example. It also, you know, I mean, it's not clear why it doesn't apply to California. California, I don't know how many people here have spent time in California. I spent a decade there. You know, I mean, it's one of the most hydraulically altered places on Earth. You know, I mean, you've got these enormous irrigation canals that carry water from Owens Valley to Los Angeles. You've got the Central California project. I've driven all around looking at. I've been interested in water for a while, and I actually shouldn't say that. I enjoy looking at the canals, and you know, they've got these crazy pumps that pump water over mountains and stuff, and you know, and Central California used to be a swamp. I mean, they drained it. I mean, it's an utterly altered environment now. So, I mean, to what extent does that imply that California should be an Asiatic despotism? Now, of course, I'm sure the Republican Party would be happy to say that California is in fact an Asiatic despotism, but it you know, it causes all kinds of problems, right? So it's not at all clear. I mean, obviously this theory can't be right, you know, and we're gonna read. In the rest of the class, we're going to read some attempts by various people to try to put their finger on what exactly is wrong about this. Okay, so this is one way I'd like you to think about what you read for today, right? Is that even when you read a book that is like obviously wrong, like you're like, this is trash, this is racist trash, and it is. Okay, but can we put our finger on exactly what's wrong about it? Because then we might be able to actually take a step beyond it and come up with a better theory, right? So that's the value in reading books like this, right? Okay, what exactly is he wrong about? And in a couple of the readings I've assigned for either next time or the time after, there's some suggestions about that. So I'd encourage you to think about that. Okay. Now, okay, the problem is, of course, that remember when I was discussing Vera Zasulich, that Marx had attributed the despotic Russian state to the invasion of the Mongols. Now, when I think about Mongols, I don't really think about massive state-directed waterworks. Mongols are pastoralists, right? They got horses on the steppe. Horses eat grass that grows from rain. These are not agriculturalists, okay? I mean, so what is he even thinking? Well, the only possible way that any of this remotely makes sense, okay, is that the Mongols conquered China. And in China, they became despotic, right? Because they're now in the Yellow River Valley, right? They learned the ways of the Asiatic despotic state and then transferred that culture to Russia, where they left it behind them, right? That's the only. So there is no in this book, right? There's no direct connection between nature and the form of the state, right? Rather, there's a positing that originally, sometime back before, right, there was a certain kind of state that arose in order to address certain kinds of needs around the organization of labor for the development of waterworks, but then became essentially severed from those materialist root connections and took on a life of its own, right? So that Wittfogel seems to think that there are sort of cultural complexes, mentalité, right, ways of thinking that persist over time, and that people can't really change the kind of people that they are. This is resonant with, well, for example, Spinoza thinks this. He thinks that he in his political treatise, he qualifies sometimes. He says, I'm talking about a free people. And if you're not a free people, for example, the Turk, then you're never going to learn to be free, right? Once you've been subjected to a total state, a system of total power, you actually just, as a people, lose your capacity for freedom, and you'll never really figure out how to be free. This is something Spinoza says. It's something that, well, it's not unlike some things that Marx and Engels say in those 1848 writings and all this kind of stuff, right? So there's a history of this kind of idea. So that's ultimately Wittfogel's answer, right? To what went wrong with the Soviet Union. Well, there are Asiatics, despotism, and there is a bureaucracy, right, that has a reason of its own. And Marx didn't take this seriously enough, right? He didn't take seriously enough the problem of bureaucracy and the independent power of the bureaucracy that doesn't simply serve the interests of private property, right? This is one of, in some ways, Wittfogel's main thesis in this book. And it's actually a thesis that we can take seriously once we've gotten rid of all this climatic racism stuff, this dubious history, this awful sociology and everything. I mean, I think that's right, okay? That there is a problem about bureaucracy. Now, I don't think that it has anything particularly to do with so-called Oriental people. I'm skeptical of that, right? I'm also, as we'll see, I'm skeptical of the idea that I'm skeptical of the idea that state organization is required to produce waterworks and investments in hydraulic alteration. So we'll get to there, but I think it's worth thinking about, right? Whether Marx's assumption in his kind of historical theory that after the modern revolution, the state and its bureaucracy are in fact nothing other than the manifestation of the interests of private property, that the state serves private property and nothing else, whether this is actually a good assumption to make or whether that assumption might be obscuring more serious problems. Okay? I'm not convinced that that's a description of the United States government, that it simply serves the interests of private property and nothing else. It might have other interests. For example, it might have an interest in supporting certain settler colonial regimes in the Middle East and suppressing any kind of dissent against them. Now, can we reduce this entirely to the interests of private property and the bourgeoisie? I don't know. It seems like there's something else going on there also. Okay, so there's some kind of a problem about the state, the bureaucracy, and what I want to explore in this class. So in my previous work and previous seminars I've given here at the New Center, I focused a lot on the problem of money. Money. I'm sure money will come up. It always comes up. But this and part of what I've tried to argue is that Marx doesn't really understand money. It's a problem for him, and this has certain consequences. In this class, I want to focus on a couple of other things, right? Which is, what about nature and what about the state? And what's interesting for Wittfogel is that he tries to link them, right? In a way that is totally unsatisfactory, right? But to say there's something about the power of nature, right? The fact, that nature, what if nature resists our attempts to negate it, right? What if we can't really remake nature in our own image? What if we could try, right? But what if there's something about nature that bites back, right? What if water in particular, and why water? I want to talk a little bit about water. In the history of economic thought, the metaphor of water pops up surprisingly often. Why do economists like the metaphor of water? Well, because water settles. Water finds its level, right? You have a tank of water, right? You got like 2 tanks and a tube, and you pour water into one, and it kind of pushes up the water in the other tank, right? I mean, water, certain systems that involve water seem to be good illustrations of equilibrating systems, systems that tend towards equilibrium. There's even a machine that was built in the early 20th century called the Moniac machine, which was a hydraulic computer that replicated the models of the economy that they had, right? They built it. They built the physical model of their economic theories of economics, using the equilibrating tendency of water as sort of the what made the computer work. So on the one hand, we have an idea of water as seeking equilibrium, right? This is an Aristotelian theory of water, right? Aristotle, who explained motion in the world as arising from the desire of each substance to find its proper place, right? So water desires to find its proper place. When it's not in its proper place, it seeks its proper place. And says Aristotle, that's why rocks fall down when you throw them in the air. Okay, I mean, it's a pretty convincing theory. Now, but what I'm interested in, and we'll read some literature about this, right, is in water as a chaotic system, right? I mean, the hydrosphere involves water sloshing around in all kinds of incredibly complicated ways. I mean, this is what, meteorologists, climate scientists study. I mean, a large part of what they do is to try to model the way that water flows. I mean, look at, just look at a picture of the clouds and tell me that this is an equilibrium seeking system. Well, I mean, it doesn't seem to be, right? It seems to be a far from equilibrium system, a wild system that, well, is subject to extreme path dependence. If you don't know what these concepts mean already, we'll get into them in a later session, okay? Subject to extreme path dependence, which is a problem for economics because economics assumes away path dependence. Let me give you an example of, there's a reason for this, and, a lot of probability theory was originally developed by a gambler, Bachelier, for the purpose of winning at gambling, and he's modeling rolls of the dice. So say I rolled 6 sixes in a row. What's the probability of getting a 6 next time? 1/6 still, right? So I mean, the idea, the point is that these, each throw of the die is uncorrelated with the previous ones. That means the system is not path dependent. This matters because you need to assume this in order to make certain results in probability theory work, right? And modern financial theory is based upon the assumption that, if you say you're looking at a price of an asset, each tick of the clock, it can either go up or down. And the theory sort of assumes that there's no path dependence in that, right? Like that each tick of the price is like throwing a new die, in that it doesn't matter about the history of it. Okay, so economics has a problem with history, and it's a problem with path dependence, and by repressing all of that, they can create a kind of metaphysics of the system they're modeling that allow it to be tractable to models in certain way, and allow it to be equilibrium seeking. Now, this seems like a problem to me. It seems that water systems are far from equilibrium, right? They're chaotic systems. There's, so you can, if you have a water wheel and you poke a hole in each, so you have a water wheel. So you got a wheel, and there's water coming in from a stream, falling into the buckets, and then the buckets, turn over, a water wheel, right? If you poke a hole in each of the buckets, this is called a Lorentz water wheel. You can Google it, Lorenz. If you poke a hole, it experiences nonlinear dynamics that make the water wheel just suddenly reverse directions at times that are basically unpredictable, or you can calculate them, but they're what's the exact concept? It's you can't, it takes more computational effort to predict the system the further out in the future you go, right? So it's non-linear. So there's all kinds of non-linear hydraulic systems, of which the hydrosphere is one, and this bothers me. I mean, I think this is interesting intellectually, but it bothers me because climate change is all about pumping energy into a vast non-linear hydraulic system that we really can't possibly predict what it's going to do. You know, you know, I'm not poo-pooing the efforts of climate scientists, although I think they have they have an immense amount of social pressure to not be alarmists, and therefore are probably actually really underestimating how bad of a situation we're in, even though they already think it's bad, but it's probably even worse than they think it is. And you know, so I mean, I think we really need to think seriously about the way that nature resists our attempts to negate it and remake it in our own image, right? And I'm hoping that we might be able to learn something useful about that by studying the deep history of things like flood control and irrigation and all kinds of things like this, right? So this is what I'm hoping to accomplish in this course. And I haven't read everything that's on the syllabus for the course, so we're discovering this all together, right? So again, please do not approach the readings as though there is it's not an Easter egg hunt, right? I haven't put the right answer for you in certain places. I've assembled material that I think looks interesting, and I want to read it all with you, and we're going to see what we can figure out. Okay. I've now been speaking for too long, so let's I can't go for 2.5 hours without a break. So let's take about a 10-minute break right now. So it's 33 minutes after the hour on my clock. Let's take 10 minutes, and we'll reconvene in 10 minutes, and then I want to hear what you think about everything that I just said and about the readings and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so I'll see you all back here in 10 minutes. Okay. So it's about time to reconvene here. So, okay, so let's reconvene. Cameras back on if you're able, and I would like to hear what you thought about what I just said, what you read for today, or just thoughts about our general topic and what you're interested in and why you're here. Any of those three topics are acceptable. So, who wants to go first? Yeah, Levy.
All right. First, thank you for the brief summary of the book. And I thought it was quite a funny book because despite all the historical and all the things that is said about the limitations of Marx or Marxist-Leninist conceptions of development, he has this uncontrollable, rancid attacks on Marxist-Leninism. It is funny. It just pops out sometimes randomly throughout the book. I found your remark about water and its inherent chaotic properties, the water cycle, and all that, quite fascinating. It kind of reminds me of this book by Manuel de Landa, Linear History, for the title, which kind of reminds me of how it is impossible to fully understand and fully master nature. And it's somehow related to this book by Wittfogel, because in one page he mentioned something about diversive or externally conditioned changes as opposed to developmental change, which is different. Developmental or teleological changes is the stages in development which are linear. It's somehow maybe Wittfogel is sketching out a kind of notion of history that is non-linear or non-teleological to some extent. And one of the quotes that I found interesting in this book is this one where he said, "Man's control over nature is an enormously significant factor in civilization, but as a criterion of progress, it must be examined together with man's relation to his fellow men and to his own convictions," which is quite interesting because, as you mentioned, I agree that maybe Wittfogel is trying to sketch out some sort of ecological Marxism, trying to infuse ecology into his model. That's my remark for so far.
Great, thank you. I think rather than respond to each comment, I want to hear from a bunch of people, and then I'll respond kind of synthetically. Somebody else had their hand up. Who was it? James? Was it you?
Yeah, I had my hand up. Thank you, first of all, for that first hour and a bit. That was really fascinating. And I'm also, like Levy, very kind of taken by the unpredictability of water. But my question really was about Wittfogel, and it's a simple one. I'm just wondering whether there are any Wittfogel apologists around at the minute. I mean, it seems like he's the sort of like embarrassing uncle at the wedding, right? But is anybody defending him? Is anybody like trying to do a more sympathetic reading, and what sort of shape would that take if there is anybody out there?
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and respond to this directly. I don't know. I mean, like I say, I mean, I wanted to teach this class because I wanted to learn more about this literature. So I don't have a mastery over all of this literature right now. I'll know a lot more about it when we're done with the class than I currently know. I get the sense that this is a book that nobody reads. And that it is a citation that floats around, and it's purely the hydraulic hypothesis. Wittfogel says that basically, states arise from the need to coordinate labor in order to make investments into waterworks, period. And that is like the entire citation. That is kind of my sense. So I would bet that there are we're going to be reading most of the stuff that I assigned is going to be arguing against that. So in particular, I want to call attention to there's a book, Agricultural Strategies, edited by Marcus and Stanish. We're reading one chapter of it. The reason I didn't assign the whole book is because my colleague Jules DeLille at Member School just taught the book in her class. And again, if this stuff's all behind a subscription, but if you're enrolled in this class, I'd be happy to send it to you for free. I can send you the class where she does the whole book. So I didn't want to repeat that. Where much of that book is an attack on Wittfogel. But even if nobody wants, I'm sure there's somebody who is like, yeah, the hydraulic hypothesis. And in fact, I think I pulled something up that was attempting to draw on this, but I doubt they engage with anything in the book beyond that, right? I really get the sense that this is a book that nobody reads, which is part of the reason I wanted to make you all read it, right? It's important. The further you get into your scholarly journey, the more you will realize that there are all kinds of floating citations to books that nobody has read in like a generation or two. And I think it's really important to actually go and read the books that the citations come from. And that's why we read this book, even though I didn't enjoy reading this book any more than you did. I mean, it was really a slog, right? And for that reason, when you're reading a book like this, you can go quickly, right? I mean, there's I know it's like, it's 500 pages or whatever, but there's whole sections of this book where you could be like, yeah, okay, I get it, and you kind of, but it is helpful to actually go back and pull up the original, precisely because then you get a sense of all of this other stuff that's motivating the conclusion, right? If you just took that hydraulic hypothesis, you wouldn't understand the reason that Wittfogel ends up in that place, which is what I tried to give you some sense of, at least my reading of it in my opening comments. So I think the citation probably still has some currency. The more interesting revisionist kind of literature all takes Wittfogel as like as a punching bag. But again, I doubt anybody has really read this book. I mean, y'all are probably some of the few people who have read this book recently. Claire.
Hi. Thank you so much as well for me. That was a really nice run through Marx and Hegel again. I have two questions. They're not very connected, but I guess my first question was whether, and I could have looked this up myself, but whether Wittfogel was in any way
it's Wittfogel.
Wittfogel, if it's German. Whether he was in any way connected or surrounded by, or was in any way engaged in any actual hydraulic experiments around where he lived. Like, is there another, was he like was he mates with the guy who did like irrigation for someone or something? So it's because it kind of, there are some of the sentences in chapter 1 are kind of, I mean, they're kind of beautiful and poetic. Like there's one where he says like, water is heavier than most plants. It's just like, it kind of seems like this guy has a fascination with water. And I was just wondering why then, because it doesn't, like he says, like I read some Weber and I read some Marx, and so I thought about water. So that's the first question. And then the other question is like whether, to the extent that from just reading this bit and from the conversation, to the extent that I understand the hydraulic hypothesis, is there, I mean, it seems to be like, this is like water if landborne, but I guess like there is a whole other world of water where water is like water in like coastal communities or water in like island areas that works in a completely different way, where it's a lot more connected to managing the chaotic nature of water. So yeah, I guess like I was wondering if the hydraulic hypothesis does encompass different geological areas. The two questions, sorry.
Yeah, okay. I mean, my guess is that he has almost no experience with any actual water. I mean, I didn't get the impression from reading this book that he knew very much about that topic. I mean, he doesn't seem very curious about it. I also don't know that he's curious about all of these differences. I mean, that's what we're gonna. He mentions Hawaii a lot, which is something I would like. That would be an interesting thing to look. I mean, so part of the idea of this curriculum, of the syllabus I put together, is that we're now going to actually go try to learn something about all of these different places, and we're going to try to notice differences, right? Because for Wittfogel, this stuff all just gets assimilated into this master concept, right? And there aren't very many interesting differences about different hydraulic regimes or different ecosystems and all of that. And there has to be something more interesting to say about all of that than what we get from him. So that's what I'm hoping to discover in what we're about to read. Miguel.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I think, first of all, thanks, Colin. That was great. I think just to add on actually on what Clara was saying, I think there's something really interesting, which I think is obviously lacking, I think, here in Wittfogel's text, which is this idea of like expertise, right? I think he speaks from such a relative vision about East and West, right? And I think it's so relative. I live in Spain, right, which is a country that its hydraulic expertise actually comes from Africa, right? So there's something really interesting about that. And I think I'm not sure how to thread it together right now, but it really links together as well with this idea of Hegel's master slave dialect, right? Of once you know how to do something, you're almost empowering yourself, right? So there's this contradiction. I'm not really threading it together, but I think there's something really interesting there about this lack of introducing this idea of an actual regional or much more specific expertise, right, within the world of hydraulics, right, which I'm sort of missing in this, which I think hopefully we'll probably look into later. But I thought, I think it was worth mentioning because I think it's something I think it's very important to take into consideration, right? Sort of geographic specificity, basically.
Good. Okay, I have a longer comment to respond to you about that, and which I will hold for a moment. Let's I'm answering the short answers now, and if there's longer answers, then I'll wait for a moment. So I'd like to hear from everybody if everybody's brave enough to speak up.
Yeah, sure. Something that I just kind of had a question, and I could answer this myself by looking ahead on the syllabus, but will we just be talking about kind of larger scale earthworks, or will we be talking about like with geographic specificity, like some smaller stuff? I just happen to have been reading about like the acequia system in northern New Mexico recently, and I find that like pretty fascinating. And I was just wondering if we're going to be dealing with kind of smaller projects as well.
Yes. We're gonna be challenging Wittfogel's ideas about scale when it comes to water that way. And also, I live in southern New Mexico too, so actually I'm very.
Hello, New Mexican. Hello.
Yeah, hello. Oh, are you in New Mexico?
I'm in Albuquerque right now, but Madrid.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I live just outside of Silver City. So.
Oh, sick! Great, I love Silver City.
Mm-hmm. Well, come down sometime. I'll buy you a beer.
All right, sounds good.
Anybody else? Who's next? I'll call on you if you don't speak up. Brett. We haven't heard from. I'll go on the. Finley, would you mind sharing some thoughts with us? What are you thinking about?
I actually signed up to the class yesterday, so I haven't had time to read
so if you
this
haven't read,
one.
that's
Sorry about that.
No, it's all good. Okay, we'll give you a pass then if you haven't read the book. We don't like to pontificate about things we haven't read. Rosella, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share with us?
Well, also thank you for the run through on Hegel and Marx. It's been a long time since my bachelor, I think, and it was really great to have that historical lesson almost and philosophical. I mean, I don't have a comment, but I would like to share that I've been doing. I mean, as you were saying about Wittfogel not having a deep thought on California, I've been doing a research on the delta of the Colorado River for almost 4 years, and I've been researching. So obviously I signed into the seminar because I'm really interested in understanding infrastructure and power dominion and settler colonialism I live in Mexico. So, I mean, in the border city with California. So I'm very excited to hear more about dam constructions, etc., flood canals, as you were talking about, and domination over a river such as the Colorado River since 20th century. So
yeah. So I mean, one thing we'll be trying to think about is the politics of water rights, which is very interesting because right there on the border with Mexico, of course, there's some complicated water rights that happen about what happens when water crosses the border and all these other sorts of things. We don't have that particular case study on the syllabus. Although if anybody is interested in particular regions, like let me know and I can probably just pull some stuff up on JSTOR and we can throw it in as optional. I'd be happy to read some more stuff. Great. Yeah. So also, I mean, even if you don't have something to say about the book or what I just said, I mean, I'm interested to hear about why you're in the class and what you're interested in, because then I can we can tweak what we're doing in order to address people's interests. So, Paula, would you mind saying something about what you're thinking?
Yeah, sure. No, I was thinking there is interest in the class, the geographical specificity, as Miguel points out. And I'm from Bogota, Colombia. So recently we had problem with the water supply. So also like how infrastructure, what you said, no, like we have overcome the necessity of nature. So that we thought, no. So I don't know, also demographically, I think in Bogota specifically is because everyone comes to Bogota. So yeah, water is not enough for all the people that is coming. It's a very centralized country, Colombia. So yeah, I think it's interesting, the group, like seeing it from different perspectives.
Great, wonderful, thank you. I think, have we heard from everybody? And Ananya, I don't know if you're there. Have we heard from you? I'm sorry, I don't remember if we have or not. Maybe you're not there. Okay. Okay, let me respond with a couple of longer responses to some things that Sarush and James said, or Matthew. Anyway, whatever. First about nonlinearity. I don't think Wittfogel has a nonlinear idea of history. That's part of what I'm trying to get at. It's been a long time since I read that DeLanda book. I liked it a lot when I read it. I might like it less now. I don't know if I agree. So I can't say he's right about. I don't remember what the book says, But the idea that history is nonlinear and this matters is surely right. This is an intuition that informs much of what I do. Now, I don't think that Wittfogel has that idea, and the reason why is that he's very invested in a stage theory typology of history. It's just that he's upset about the categories getting mixed up. Okay, so a lot of this, a lot of what he talks about in this book, and in a way, like, okay, what's Wittfogel's like war against these other Marxists? So Wittfogel, even though he's a right winger, right, actually could be described as an anti-revisionist Marxist, right? He's mad because he thinks that other people are revising the theory of Marxism, right, in ways that serve their short-term interests but are not faithful to the theory. And his beef is that he's against calling the Russian regime feudal, right? He says it's not feudalism, right? It's not feudalism, it's Asiatic despotism, and they're different. Okay, that's in some ways a major thesis of this book and an obsession of some of his other writings. For precisely the reason that feudalism is what sets the stage for capitalism, right? Capitalism progresses out of feudalism. And he thinks that the Russian system isn't the right kind of feudalism out of which capitalism can progress, right? And why is that? Like, what's the difference? Actually, you might want to take a stab at that. Like, what's the difference? Like, if Wittfogel says the Russian Tsar is not feudalism, it's Oriental despotism, and that really matters because history has an order that it goes in, and if you mistake the stage that you're in, then you mistake the stage that comes out of it, and all these other sorts of things. And there's this, he's anxious, he wants to describe the to describe Stalinism as an Asiatic restoration, right? So his thesis is that, so he thinks, right, he seems to think that, you know, the Bolshevik, sorry, not even the Bolshevik Revolution, my Russian history is a little weak, the revolution before the Bolsheviks took over, the February Revolution, is that what it is? The first revolution like had a real radical potential that then the Bolsheviks kind of destroyed by restoring the Asiatic despotism, right? So he's upset because he thinks that, you know, the early Lenin acknowledged that the Russian regime was an Asiatic despotism, but then they changed it and they started referring to it as feudalism. Why did they do that? Because that made it possible for them to set up their own revolution as analogous to the French Revolution, but really they're lying about which typology of society they are. Okay, so if I say this, I mean, what's the difference between Asiatic despotism and feudalism? Why, according to Wittfogel, is the Tsar not a feudal king, but rather an Asiatic despot? I mean, what's the difference? There is a key difference.
Well, according to him, like that would, Asiatic despotism would be like stagnation and outside of like this order of progress, and resetting it up as feudalism puts it into this order of progress that makes sense within his framework.
Yes, but there's a specific difference that makes it not part of the order of progress. Clara?
Is it? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Let's raise hands so I
Okay.
can direct traffic. Yeah, Clara.
I got the sense that it had something to do with how power is distributed between center and periphery, and that there is a, I mean, it doesn't like the argument like still rests on the fact that like the center is like random and is in its despotic use of power, but it seems to have something to do with how the different areas of like gigantic continents are being administered by these people who have ultimate control, but it could also just as easily be taken away. And he uses like the satraps, the Raj, and someone else. I mean, like in my head, like the question would be a little bit like, what's with the Holy Roman Empire? I mean, like, how did that work? Did that not work in a very similar way? How does the Catholic Church work? Probably in a similar way. Or how do the Medici work? Not too dissimilar. But I think that it seemed like almost like a shape that he created in his head of how this works.
Okay. Good. Getting warmer. Sarush, you had something you wanted to say?
Yes, I guess I don't know. I'm just guessing here, but I think that there is a difference in Oriental despotism. You actually have this one person who is in charge of everything. Maybe this is a difference, because there is not even some places there is not even a system. There's just literally just one person who is the sole owner of every source or resources, and I guess there is a difference. And you mentioned, I don't know, maybe we have time later to discuss this, but because I'm from the Middle East, you know, I'm Iranian. So I guess it's not that much of a racist claim. I mean, this there is some truth in it. This is the culture here. This is the desert. Here people live in the desert, and the desert is a different phenomena. Really, I mean, it's not just that there is like a European centrism stuff going on here, but we can actually feel it. It's actually in the culture, in every little bit of life and culture and politics here. Really makes a difference. Maybe it's not just his maybe I don't know, Eurocentrism stuff.
Right. No, I mean, this is an important point, right? I mean, it isn't inherently racist necessarily, right? To say, look, I mean, different cultures have different kinds of constitutions. There's different ways that power works in different political societies. We need to think about that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
nor is it even necessarily racist to say, look, I mean, there's different ecological zones in the world, and you can't just take the European state out of a box and install it in any place you like. I mean, maybe there are ecological reasons or constraints or determinations of the way that power works. I mean, maybe there's even cultural momentum, right? Right. I mean, maybe, when you have a society that's been organized in a certain way for hundreds of years, it's not so easy to just change it, I mean, none of
I
those.
guess even more than that, it's not just that we have on the one part, we have some kind of a, like the organization, distribution of water, and then we have religion, and then we have theology. They are just, some places, they're actually the same thing. I mean, the God in this culture is basically the one who is distributing water.
Yes.
If you don't have water, he can kill you.
Yes.
So
Yes.
and it goes into political theology, and we can discuss that. But I guess it's not that much of a kind error to classify these societies as such.
Right. So I take your point, and I think it's important, right? It's not my intention here to rule certain topics completely out of investigation because they're uncomfortable or things like this, right?
Off the top of my head, I didn't mean that.
Well, let me finish though. Then you can speak again. But what I do think makes Wittfogel's presentation of this racist. I mean, I do think he's like an old school climatological racist, which is an older form of racism than kind of the kind that we have more often now. But anyway, but what I do think makes it racist is that he's totally uninterested in the differences between all of the different places and peoples that he subsumes under the category of Asiatic despotism. It's enough for him to just say they're Oriental, they're Asiatic, and in a way that's all that you could say about it. Now, I have a hard time believing that everything we would want to say about Hawaii and about Iran are all subsumed under this ideal type thing, right? And so I think what would make it not racist is if we were actually curious about all of the things that we're studying here, and we actually wanted to take different peoples more seriously in responding to the conditions in which they find themselves, but of having real problems and not simply being just essentially what he is saying in this book is that everybody who isn't a European is just a natural slave. I mean, this is essentially a natural slavery, and that's where the prostration comes in. Right, Europeans are the only people who don't prostrate themselves before the king, and that shows that everybody else is naturally servile, and so they kind of lack the capacity for freedom. I mean, that is essentially where he ends up. So I think the question for us is, how do we take seriously all of the questions that Sarush has just outlined and not write them off as, this is bad because it's politically incorrect or something like this, right? I mean, obviously that would be an unsatisfactory way to approach this problem. But how do we do it in a way that also doesn't lead us to where Wittfogel is saying? Okay, Sarush, you wanted to elaborate. Please continue.
No, maybe later we will talk about it. Just wanted to say that, like, yeah, it's there are some elements there. It's not. I mean, you can feel it. I mean, in a society where you have shortage of water. I mean, it penetrates every aspect of your culture and life and theology, like Zoroastrianism. Like, why the whole stuff about the religious specificity of the sun and the light. We have it in different kinds of actually religions and philosophies, ontologies. It's there, and I guess it's interesting. Even I don't know if we can approach it from the exact viewpoint that Wittfogel did, but it's important. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think that's an important thing to put on the table, right? And again, I mean, my ask here is that we should take Wittfogel as a negative example of how to proceed on this research project, And the negative example is just that he's totally incurious about all of this stuff, right? I mean, in many of these passages, he's literally just like, I think we can probably assume that, in China things work like this, and then maybe he's got like one citation to like one book about China, right? But this is well, somebody brought up Weber. Weber is another significant. This is a Weberian book. I don't know if you've ever tried to. And so in my work on money, I've had to look at Weber, and Weber will just go on for hundreds of pages with no footnotes or support of anything he says. He's just like, I'm Max Weber. I know everything. I'm telling you about how everything works. And there's absolutely no way to like check any of his claims or like figure out why he even thought what he did, because he's just like, you can't disagree with me. I'm Max Weber. So there's a similar kind of energy happening in this book, right? So let's be curious, right? Let's be curious about this stuff. Let's be willing to be surprised by what we find. Let's be willing to have our preconceived ideas about the ultimate shape of human history, right? I mean, challenged by what we find. That's my ask for the way we approach this. So I want to loop back though to this question about Asiatic despotism versus feudalism. What for Wittfogel is the answer? And I think Clara came pretty close, but there's one more thing that I think needs to be mentioned. And Levy, do you want to take a stab at it?
Is it corvée labor?
Well, I think for Wittfogel, no, because corvée labor is also sometimes part of Western feudalism, in that like the peasant owes a certain number of days to the lord and stuff like that. So I think no. The specific answer that Wittfogel is looking for, okay, is security of property. Okay, he's very insistent on this. So now, what makes Asiatic despotism despotic? It's that there is no security of property. And this is related to what Clara was saying, right? About there being one guy who owns everything. But if your property is held at the whim of the state, such that the state can revoke your property whenever it wants to, right? This means that you don't have security of property, which means what? Well, you're not going to invest in it, right? You don't have the security of your property such that you want to make long-term investments in improving it, right? That's essentially the key. And so for Wittfogel, he sort of thinks that Western feudalism differs from Asiatic despotisms in that feudal property is more secure, right? I mean, the king cannot simply seize the lands of his barons in England. For example, I mean, read Richard II. That's where that play starts, okay? Shakespeare, Richard II, which we read from one of my previous New Center classes. It's in the archive. I mean that's the problem, is that Richard just seizes the lands of Bolingbroke for his own reasons, and this is what leads to his downfall, right? I mean, so the question is whether property is derivative of the state, right? In the sense that there is property only because the state says there is, and because the king, really the despot, right? And if the despot says that's not your property anymore, then it just ceases to be your property, right? The question is whether property involves a claim that can be asserted against the state, and to which the state is bound, right, to respect. That's the key for him. So in despotic societies, says Wittfogel, this doesn't happen. Now, well, again, I mean, there is the name escapes me there. In the Ottoman Empire, they have this whole system of Timurs, or I think it's called Timurs. I mean, they have property that looks kind of like feudal property, except you can't pass it down to your heirs, right? When you die, it reverts to the state, and so you can't have dynastic lineages that have property, right? And so now, well, this is a whole time, that there's often processes, long-term processes in systems of land tenure, in which property that didn't used to be hereditary becomes hereditary, right? So this is kind of what happens in Western Europe. In fact, is that you have various kinds of land holderships that's supposed to not be hereditary, but then it just kind of becomes hereditary because, the guy who has it just gives it to his son and nobody challenges him. And, that goes on for 200 years and boom, it's hereditary, right? So, but we could, there's one thing we're not doing in this class, but would not be unrelated to our topic, okay, is studying the history of comparative study of land tenure in various places, right? What are the legal regimes under which people hold land, and what kind of security do they have in that land? Because it does. I mean, I'm not sure I would want to fully endorse this, the standard liberal take on this. I mean, secure private property is always good because then you can make investments in it. And if you ever have insecure property, then your society will stagnate because nobody can invest in their property and stuff. But it's not totally untrue, right? There's something there that matters. So it would not be unrelated to our topic to study land tenure. But actually, that moves me on to something I wanted to say in response to Matthew, and also whoever it was who lives in Spain. We're going to read about Spain. Actually, the chapter that I picked from Marcus and Stanish is about Spain. Spain is interesting, of course, because the Christians. It wasn't so long ago that most of Spain wasn't Christian, but was rather Muslim. And when the Christians took over Muslim Spain, part of what they took over was a lot of waterworks, irrigation canals, all these sorts of things, of a much more sophisticated variety than they were doing in Castile and Aragon or any places like this, which are more highland territories, and so they're more pastoralists and stuff like this, right? So the Muslim Spain put an enormous amount of investment into irrigation works that were then taken over by the Christians, and there's some interesting history there of which we'll be reading about a lot. But this is also relevant to New Mexico, which of course not so long ago was Spain. And one interesting thing that kind of happens here, is that water rights are a weird kind of property, and they don't always. What's weird about water rights, right, is that, okay, so here in New Mexico where I live, there's two different waves of settler cultures, right? There's a Hispanophone settler culture and there's an Anglophone settler culture, and there's a lot of racial tension between those two groups, although they're both settlers, okay, right? It's not a settler versus indigenous thing. It's a two waves of settlers who have tension with one another. But part of what's interesting, right, is that when a new power group takes over, they don't generally completely tear up the system of water rights and start over, right? So a lot of the water rights in New Mexico were originally granted by the King of Spain, and they're still valid, right? I mean, they're still there, right? So there's something about, and we'll read a little bit about this, right? There's something about water rights and the way that those kind of property claims work that are very conservative in the sense of persisting even across changes in legal regimes and property ownership otherwise, okay? And there are other ways in which, indigenous tribes have water rights that are like very senior, right? Because they've been here for the longest, right? So even though they, are politically disenfranchised in all kinds of terrible ways, right? There actually is a certain kind of power that they have when it comes to water rights. And so one of the things we'll be thinking about, right, is to what extent, right, if water rights are like this very fundamental layer of law, and it's a kind of law that isn't posited by the state, but seems to persist in interesting ways, even despite changes in the state and the legal regime otherwise, right? So like, what's going on with that? That's something that has intrigued me about water that I hope we'll be able to get into and maybe figure out something interesting about. Yeah, Clara.
Oops. Just a question on like the origin of water rights. I'm just like in the early stages of looking at like I don't know. It's at some point it occurred to me as like quite strange, but maybe my historical reading isn't nuanced enough that I think it was the it was Grotius's Mora Liberum that started off like a particular theory of sovereignty to spin, which then gave us the state. But the whole idea of like a European state as such could only exist once Grotius had said it's totally fine for us to like be pirates because that's a no man's land. I guess like I was just wondering whether there will be at any point we'll look into like to what extent any definition of land territory is also based on a definition of water territory. Yeah,
that's a great question, and we're not doing it in this class. Just, I mean, there's forces.
Cool.
So I mean, but it's in another class we definitely should. I think this might have come up a little bit in my previous one on the history of sovereignty. It's definitely important, but this class is mostly about freshwater, not about saltwater, I guess would be my answer to that. There's all kinds of questions about saltwater, the law of the sea. You know, this is stuff I just taught Schmidt in my other class. You know, Schmidt's Nomos of the Earth is all about this kind of stuff. Very interesting, but we won't be doing it in this class. Although if we can bring it in and find a connection, then great. I don't want to. I'm not trying to police the topic, but it's not on the syllabus. We're mostly looking at freshwater.
All good, thank you though.
Yeah. Okay, so it's about time to wrap up. I will say a little bit about what we're going to be reading for next time. But anybody else have any more burning thoughts, comments? Okay. So next time we're going to be taking a look at a couple of books. One is called Thirst, Water, and Power in the Ancient World. So we're going to be moving back and looking at some ancient stuff. So we'll be looking at, I think there's stuff in there about aqueducts and, Greco-Roman history, about water management. So there's that book. For that one, I picked a couple of chapters that I'd like everybody to read. If you're up for the task, read the whole book. But if not, read those 2 chapters that I assigned, and then just pick some other chapters and read them, right? We don't all have to read the same thing, right? What I kind of want is for students to find interesting stuff in the various places and then bring them to us and put them on the table for us to have a discussion. Okay, so you can kind of pick what you want to read from that book. And then I also assigned one chapter from a book on the Yellow River, so the other side of the old world from the Greco-Roman material, which is what I know best. I have a background in classics, but we don't want to pretend like the Greeks and Romans are the only thing there is. So we're also going to be reading a little bit about the Yellow River, and I just assigned one chapter from that book. But if you want to read more and report back about what you find, that would be wonderful. Okay, well, I think it's about time to wrap up.
Could you say something about the presentations, maybe? Like, how do you want to...
yeah, on the presentations. So I noticed on the list that a lot of y'all are certificate students, so I think you're required to do a presentation and write a paper if you want credit. So on the presentations, again, okay, first thing I want to say is please do not give us biographical information about the authors. I just don't, unless it's like the Wittfogel stuff was incredibly relevant, but I don't want that. And if you want to write something out, you can. I would encourage you to try to present extempore in the same way that I've been presenting. I think it is helpful for your comprehension if you are saying things that you understand well enough to actually say them, right? Rather than reading from something that you prepared for. When you do that, your prepared notes get in the way of between you and the subject material. So I would encourage, if you don't feel comfortable doing that, then it's okay. You can read some prepared notes. But I would like for you to just speak about something that you read, right? Maybe say call our attention to something specific, right? I noticed this. Try to use I noticed, right? Let's something that you noticed about the text, and then try to connect it to the problems space that I've been trying to lay out for you in this session, and then see if you can generate some concepts out of it, right? So I kind of have 3 tasks for your presentations. Notice something, connect it to our problems, generate some concepts that out of what you notice. That would be ideal. Right. And again, if you want to make a PowerPoint presentation and stuff, you can, but I would really discourage you from doing that. I would encourage you to try to develop a more intuitive connection to what you're saying, right? I mean, if at the point where you can speak off the top of your head at length about something you've been thinking about, that's when you actually have it like integrated into your body knowledge, right? In a way that it's not just the formal manipulation of symbols, and that will greatly increase your understanding. Does anybody have any questions about it? And I think you claim, I think the coordinator will assign you a slot and all of that. I'm not involved in that, so just pick a slot and we will do that. And I don't know. I'm not sure whether we will. I will probably say some brief things at the beginning of next session. We will then have the presentations. I will then say some more things, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll have conversation like we just did today. Any questions about all of that?
How long are they?
Is there a does the handbook say is there a time they're supposed to be, or is it up to me?
You know, maybe it could be like 10 minutes, the presentation.
Yeah. I would say 10 to 15 minutes, right? Don't you, and again, you do not need to say everything, right? It's not a book report in which you prove that you read the book. I'm not interested in you proving that you read the book by saying everything that it says. I want you to pick something, notice it, connect it to what we're thinking about, develop some concepts out of it. Boom, that's it. 10 to 15 minutes. Okay, great. I will see you all.
Sorry,
yes.
I guess maybe I missed something here. Which book are we going to work on for the reports, for the discussion?
Well, you can pick.
It's up to us.
It's up to you. I don't want two people presenting on the same chapter. Pick a chapter from a book to present on. Sure. Not the whole book. And the coordinator will make sure that we're not overlapping. So just check in with him. Okay, great, everyone.
Thank you.
Well, this was a lot of fun. I look forward to learning some things about hydraulics for the remaining 3 sessions. So I will see you all next time. Bye. And also, I'm on Discord. The Google Classroom thing, I find a little. Ping me on Discord or send me an email at colindrum@gmail.com, and I will respond to you promptly if there's anything you want to talk about. Okay, bye everyone. Thank you.
Sure. Bye.